The message arrived at 0347 hours, Greenwich Mean Time, on a cold Tuesday morning in late November. It came not through radio waves or quantum entanglement, but through a method humanity had not yet conceived possible: a direct injection into every electronic device capable of displaying text or producing sound across the entire planet. Every screen flickered. Every speaker crackled. And then, in a voice that seemed to resonate with ancient authority, the message played. Species designation: human. Homeworld designation: Sol 3. Classification: pre-emergence sentient. You are hereby notified that your system has been claimed by the eternal dominion of the Galactic Throne. You will prepare for integration within one standard rotation of your planet around its star. Resistance will result in cleansing. Compliance will result in servitude. There is no alternative. This message will not repeat. The silence that followed lasted approximately 17 seconds before the world descended into chaos. Admiral Chen Wei-lin was standing on the observation deck of the United Earth Space Command headquarters in Geneva when the message came through. She watched the reflection of the text scroll across the reinforced glass, her weathered face betraying nothing of the cold calculation happening behind her dark eyes. "Admiral?" Her aide, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, approached with visible anxiety. "The Security Council is convening. They're requesting your presence." "Of course they are," Chen said quietly. She didn't move from her position at the window. The Alps rose in the distance, snow-capped and eternal, utterly indifferent to the existential crisis unfolding around them. "Tell me, Marcus, what do you know about asymmetric warfare?" Webb blinked. "Admiral? Asymmetric warfare. David and Goliath. The strategy of the weaker force against the stronger." "I studied it at the academy, ma'am. Guerrilla tactics, unconventional methods, using the enemy's strength against them." Chen finally turned from the window. Her expression was not one of fear or panic. It was something far more concerning to anyone who knew her. It was the expression she wore when she was planning something that would make history books uncomfortable. "That's the textbook answer," she said. "But here's what the textbooks don't tell you. Asymmetric warfare isn't about winning. It's about changing the rules so completely that winning and losing become meaningless concepts. It's about making the strong question whether strength itself has any value." She walked past Webb toward the door. "Come, let's see what our politicians have to say about surrendering the human race." The United Nations Security Council emergency session was exactly the disaster Chen had anticipated. Representatives from 212 nations crowded into the General Assembly Hall, their voices a cacophony of fear, denial, and barely restrained hysteria. Secretary General Amara Okonkwo gavelled for order for the 7th time, her patience visibly fraying. "We will have silence, or I will have this chamber cleared." The noise gradually subsided, though the tension remained thick enough to taste. "We have confirmed," Okonkwo continued, "that the message was authentic. Our astronomers have detected an object at the edge of our solar system, beyond the Kuiper Belt. It is approximately 800 kilometers in diameter and is moving inward at a velocity our physicists describe as theoretically impossible." A murmur rippled through the chamber. "Current estimates suggest this. Vessel will reach Earth orbit in approximately 14 months, well within the timeline specified in the message." The Chinese delegate rose. "Secretary General, we must discuss terms of negotiation. Perhaps this dominion can be reasoned with. Perhaps servitude is preferable to extinction." "Servitude?" The American delegate shot to his feet. "You would have humanity kneel?" I would have humanity survive, the Chinese delegate replied coldly. Pride is a luxury of those who have options. The chamber erupted again. Okonkwo's gavel was drowned in the noise. From her position in the military advisors gallery, Admiral Chen watched the spectacle with growing contempt. These were supposed to be the leaders of humanity, the best and brightest their species had to offer. And here they were, squabbling over the terms of their own enslavement, like merchants haggling over the price of cattle. She leaned over to General Kowalski, the commander of the European Defense Forces. How long before this devolves into actual violence? Kowalski snorted. Give it an hour, maybe 2. We don't have an hour. Chen stood and began walking toward the main floor. Security personnel moved to intercept her, but something in her bearing made them hesitate. Admiral Chen, Okonkwo called out, the Military Advisory Committee has not been recognized. Then recognize me, Chen said, mounting the stairs to the podium. Because while you debate the color of our chains, I have an alternative proposal. The chamber fell silent. Chen had that effect on people. It wasn't her rank or her authority. It was something in her eyes, a calculation so cold it seemed to drop the temperature of any room she entered. 1 year, she said. 1 year to prepare. 1 year to develop weapons we don't yet possess. 1 year to become something we've never been. And what is that? The Russian delegate asked. Chen smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. A species worth fearing. 3 weeks after the Dominion's ultimatum, the world's scientific, military, and industrial resources were consolidated under a single unified command structure. It was called the Terran Defense Initiative, and its headquarters was built directly into the Swiss Alps, a facility so deep and so heavily reinforced that it could theoretically survive the complete destruction of the surface. Admiral Chen stood at the head of the central planning room, surrounded by screens displaying data from every corner of the planet. Before her sat the greatest minds humanity had to offer: physicists, engineers, strategists, and philosophers, gathered from every nation that had contributed to the effort. Let me be clear about our situation, Chen began. We are outmatched in every conventional metric. Our enemy has faster-than-light travel, energy weapons that can vaporize continents, and ships larger than our largest cities. They have conquered thousands of worlds. We have never left our solar system. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Conventional wisdom says we cannot win. Conventional wisdom says we should surrender and hope for mercy. But conventional wisdom is written by those who have never faced true extinction. She activated a holographic display showing the massive Dominion vessel approaching through the outer solar system. Our analysts have been studying the message and what limited data we've gathered about the Dominion, and we've discovered something interesting. This empire, this eternal Dominion, has existed for roughly 50,000 years. They've conquered over 12,000 species. Not one of those conquests took more than a single planetary rotation to complete. Because no one can resist them, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the project's lead physicist, interjected. No, Chen corrected, because no one has tried. Not really. You see, the Dominion's strategy is elegant in its simplicity. They arrive with overwhelming force. They issue their ultimatum, and species that evolve to survive, to prioritize self-preservation, do the mathematically rational thing. They surrender. She zoomed in on the approaching vessel. But what happens when a species doesn't surrender? What happens when the cost-benefit analysis that has worked for 50,000 years suddenly produces an error? We're going to find out. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the project's military historian, raised his hand.
Admiral, with respect, we've studied the records. The Dominion has faced resistance before. They simply destroy the resisting population and move on to the next conquest. They've faced resistance, Chen agreed. But have they faced war? Real war? The kind of war where victory isn't the goal? Where the goal is to make victory too expensive to be worth pursuing? She pulled up another display, historical images from Earth's past. The jungles of Vietnam, the mountains of Afghanistan, the frozen wastes of the Russian front. Humanity has been perfecting the art of making empires bleed for thousands of years. We've never won against overwhelming force through strength alone. We've won by making the strong question whether the cost of victory is worth paying. General Kowalski leaned forward. You're talking about insurgency, guerrilla warfare. I'm talking about something more fundamental than that. The Dominion's power is based on a simple equation. The cost of resistance always exceeds the cost of surrender. We're going to break that equation. We're going to make resistance so costly for them that conquest becomes irrational. How? Dr. Vasquez asked. Chen smiled that cold smile again. By becoming the most dangerous thing in the universe. Not the strongest, not the most advanced, the most dangerous. There's a difference. Project Prometheus had 17 subdivisions, each focused on a different aspect of humanity's desperate gambit. But 4 divisions would prove to be the most significant. Division 1 was called Hydra, and its mission was simple: ensure that humanity could not be decapitated. When the Dominion arrived, they would find no central command to capture, no single leader whose death would end resistance. Every human would be trained in the basics of warfare. Every community would be self-sufficient. Every city would be its own fortress. Division 2 was called Prometheus proper, the development of new weapons. But these weren't weapons designed to match Dominion firepower. These were weapons designed to be impossible to defend against using conventional means. Kinetic impactors that could be launched from anywhere. Biological agents tailored to attack alien physiology. Nanoscale devices that could reproduce and consume. Psychological warfare tools that could break the will of any commander. Division 3 was called Orpheus, and its mission was perhaps the most audacious of all: understanding the Dominion. Not their technology, but their psychology, their culture, their fears. Every intelligence asset on Earth was redirected to a single purpose: finding the cracks in the Dominion's armor. Division 4 was called Icarus, and it was the only division whose existence was kept secret even from most of Project Prometheus's leadership. Its mission? Develop a weapon so terrible that its use would change the nature of galactic civilization forever. Part 3. The Arrival. The Dominion vessel, later designated Harbinger by human forces, entered Earth orbit exactly 387 days after the initial ultimatum. It was, as advertised, approximately 800 kilometers in diameter, a sphere of dark metal that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. The ship took position in geosynchronous orbit above Geneva, its shadow falling across half of Europe. For 3 days, it did nothing, said nothing, simply hung in the sky like a second moon, a constant reminder of the power that had come to claim humanity. On the 4th day, a second message was broadcast. Species designation: human. Your integration period has concluded. Prepare your representatives for collection. You will surrender all weapons. You will surrender all governmental authority. You will surrender all means of resistance. This is not negotiable. The response came not from the United Nations, which had been dissolved 3 months prior.
It came from Admiral Chen, speaking from an undisclosed location somewhere in the Terran Defense Network. This is Admiral Chen Wei-Lin, speaking on behalf of humanity. We decline your offer of integration. We decline your offer of servitude. We decline to acknowledge your authority over our world, our species, or our future. She paused. You have issued a threat. Now hear our answer. If you attempt to land forces on our world, they will not survive to return to your vessel. If you bombard our cities, we will rebuild them on your ashes. If you destroy our planet, we will become the ghosts that haunt your empire for the next 50,000 years. You cannot kill an idea, you cannot enslave a principle, and you cannot defeat a species that has decided death is preferable to submission. Another pause. Welcome to Earth. Welcome to war. The Dominion's response was swift and, by their standards, restrained. They deployed what their tactical analysts later estimated was approximately 0.3% of their available ground forces, roughly 50,000 soldiers to the surface of Earth. These soldiers were members of the Varkesh, a species that had served the Dominion as shock troops for roughly 12,000 years. They were 7 feet tall, covered in chitinous armor, and possessed strength sufficient to tear a human apart with their bare appendages. They landed in 3 major population centers: Geneva, New York, and Beijing. The Dominion expected these landings to establish control points from which further integration would proceed. None of the landing forces survived the first hour. Commander Kravik of the Dominion subjugation forces was not accustomed to failure. In his 300 years of service, he had overseen the integration of 47 species. Not one of those integrations had resulted in significant Dominion casualties. The first reports from the surface were, therefore, confusing. Commander, we've lost contact with Landing Force Geneva. Define lost contact. Their biosignatures have ceased, all of them. The records indicate within 17 minutes of landing. Kravik's mandibles clicked, the Varkesh equivalent of disbelief. 17 minutes? We landed 50,000 warriors. Yes, Commander, they're all dead. What the Dominion couldn't understand, was that humanity had spent the past year preparing not for a battle, but for an ambush. The cities where the Dominion landed weren't cities anymore. They were traps. Every building was rigged with explosives. Every street was a kill zone. Every sewer tunnel was a deployment corridor for hit-and-run attacks. The moment Dominion forces touched down, they were hit with weapons they had never encountered. Kinetic projectiles moving at impossible velocities. Humanity had perfected railgun technology to a terrifying degree. Autonomous drones, small enough to fit inside a Varkesh soldier's armor, carrying charges designed to detonate inside their bodies. Chemical agents tailored to the Varkesh respiratory system, synthesized based on biological data Orpheus Division had somehow obtained. And most terrifying of all, human soldiers who didn't fight like soldiers at all. They didn't form lines. They didn't defend positions. They struck from shadows, from sewers, from rubble, and then vanished. They detonated explosives that shouldn't have existed, in locations that shouldn't have been accessible. They died with smiles on their faces, taking Dominion soldiers with them through pure suicidal fury. The Varkesh were elite warriors. They were trained to fight against other warriors. They were not trained to fight against ghosts. Part 4. The Education of Empire. Commander Kravik requested permission to escalate. This request was unprecedented.
In the entire history of the Dominion, no subjugation commander had ever requested escalation during a routine integration. The very concept was humiliating. But the reports from Earth were unlike anything in Dominion records. The initial landing force was gone. A follow-up force of 200,000 was suffering 40% casualties per day with minimal confirmed kills. The human defenders seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. They used weapons that defied conventional armor. They employed tactics that defied conventional warfare. They attacked logistics lines that shouldn't have been accessible. They destroyed command posts that were supposed to be invisible. Worse, they were learning, adapting. Every Dominion tactic that worked once seemed to fail the second time it was employed. Every weapon system that proved effective was quickly countered. It was as if the entire species was a single organism, constantly adjusting its immune response. The Eternal Throne granted Kravik's request. The orbital bombardment of Earth began 11 days after the initial landing. They started with the cities. Geneva was the first to burn, a concentrated beam of plasma that turned the ancient seat of human diplomacy into a crater of molten glass. Then New York, then Beijing, then London, Moscow, Tokyo, Paris. Billions died in the first day of bombardment. The Dominion expected this to end resistance. It expected the survivors to emerge from hiding, broken and compliant, ready to accept integration. Instead, they received another transmission. Admiral Chen's face appeared on Dominion screens. She was clearly underground somewhere. The walls behind her were rough stone, illuminated by emergency lighting. But her expression was unchanged. That same cold calculation, that same terrifying calm. 53 million dead in the first bombardment, she said. Our ancestors lost nearly that many in a single war we fought among ourselves. We learned something from that experience. We learned that human beings are capable of enduring absolutely anything if they believe their sacrifice has meaning. She leaned forward. You've given our sacrifice meaning. Every life you take strengthens our resolve. Every city you destroy becomes a monument to your failure. You cannot bomb us into submission, because submission requires a will to live, and you've killed that will. All that remains is the will to hurt you. Behind her, something moved. A map, a star map, appearing on a display. While you've been burning our cities, we've been busy. Your vessel, the one in our orbit, we've been studying it, learning it, and now we're going to teach you something about humanity. She smiled. We don't need to destroy your ship to win. We just need to make you afraid to use it. The Dominion called it the Ghost Protocol. Humanity called it Operation Orpheus. While the bombardment continued, small teams of human operatives, enhanced with prototype neural interfaces and equipped with technology that shouldn't have existed, infiltrated the Harbinger. Not through conventional means. They used maintenance pods, emergency airlocks, waste disposal systems. Any opening, no matter how small, no matter how dangerous. The first team of 12 made it aboard after 17 hours of zero-gravity transit in modified spacesuits designed to be invisible to Dominion sensors. 9 of them died in the first day aboard, killed by automated defense systems, by Dominion crew members, by the simple impossibility of surviving in an alien environment. The remaining 3 lived for 11 days. In that time, they accomplished the impossible. They mapped the ship's layout. They identified critical systems. They planted devices so small they were undetectable by Dominion scanners. Most importantly, they sent a message to their colleagues on Earth. We can break them, but you have to send more of us, many more. Over the next 3 months, humanity launched 847 infiltration missions against the Harbinger. Only 12% of infiltrators survived longer than 48 hours, but that 12% was enough. Commander Kravik was in his command center when the first sabotage occurred. The ship's primary power grid experienced a cascade failure that took 18 hours to repair. Dominion engineers attributed it to a manufacturing defect. The second incident occurred a week later. 3 junior officers were found dead in their quarters, killed by what appeared to be malfunctioning life support systems. An investigation concluded that nothing was wrong with the systems. The third incident was impossible to explain. Commander Kravik woke in his personal quarters to find a message carved into the wall beside his sleeping alcove. It was written in perfect Varkesh script. "We are inside your ship. We are inside your mind. We will never stop." From that moment, the Harbinger was no longer a weapon of conquest. It was a ship under siege from within. Part 5. The Psychology of Terror. The Orpheus Division had done its work well. They had studied the Varkesh extensively, not their technology, but their culture, their psychology, their fears. The Varkesh were a warrior species, but not in the human sense. Their concept of warfare was ritualistic, formal. There were rules about who could fight, how they could fight, when surrender was acceptable. Death in battle was honorable. Death by assassination was shameful. Death by an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't understand, that wasn't just dishonorable, it was terrifying. Human infiltrators didn't attack Varkesh warriors in combat. They attacked them in their sleep, in their mess halls, in their sanitation facilities. They used methods that seemed impossible, poisons that couldn't be detected, weapons that couldn't be traced, deaths that couldn't be explained. Within 2 months, the Harbinger's crew was experiencing a psychological breakdown that had no precedent in Dominion history. Soldiers refused to sleep. Officers refused to eat. Crew members began attacking each other out of paranoid delusion. The ship's medical facilities were overwhelmed with cases of what the Varkesh called soul sickness, a condition their psychologists had never seen in a combat situation. Commander Kravik sent increasingly desperate reports to the Eternal Throne. His requests for reinforcement were denied. The Dominion's resources were needed elsewhere, and surely one primitive species couldn't require significant attention. His requests to withdraw were denied. The Dominion did not retreat. So Kravik did the only thing he could do. He escalated again. The systematic destruction of Earth's surface began on what humans would later call Black Saturday. It wasn't a tactical bombardment, it was an extermination attempt. Every population center, every infrastructure node, every concentration of human life that Dominion sensors could detect. The casualty figures were beyond comprehension. 4 billion dead in the first week. The survivors fled underground into the shelter networks that had been built during the preparation year. But even the shelters couldn't survive sustained bombardment. What saved humanity was not military resistance. It was the Dominion's own psychology. The Varkesh were warriors. They understood and respected resistance. What they couldn't understand was what happened next. As the bombardment continued, human transmission frequencies began carrying not pleas for mercy, not desperate appeals for negotiation, but something far more disturbing: celebration. Songs, stories, jokes about death, laughter in the face of extinction. "You think we fear death?" one intercepted transmission read. "We've been preparing for death since we invented religion. We've been romanticizing death since we invented art. You can kill our bodies, but you can't kill our meaning. And as long as we have meaning, we have victory. The final phase of Operation Icarus was activated on the 37th day of the surface bombardment. Throughout the preparation year, Division 4 had been working on a single project, the development of a weapon that could threaten not just the Harbinger, but the Dominion itself. The weapon wasn't what the Dominion expected. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a biological agent. It wasn't a fleet of ships or a super soldier program. It was information. Orpheus Division's infiltrators had spent months mapping the Dominion's communication networks. They had identified the quantum entanglement nodes that allowed instantaneous communication across the Empire. They had learned how to access these nodes. And now, they used them. The message was broadcast simultaneously to every world in the Dominion. Every species, every planet, every consciousness that had been subjected to Dominion rule received the same transmission. It began with images, the bombardment of Earth, the destruction of human cities, the casualties, rendered not as statistics but as individuals, names, faces, stories. Then came the human message. This is what the Dominion does. This is what they've always done. But here's what they've never told you. They can be fought. They can be hurt. They can be made to bleed. The transmission showed footage of human resistance, the destruction of Dominion landing forces, the infiltration of the Harbinger, the psychological collapse of the Varkesh crew. For 50,000 years, you've believed resistance was impossible. You've believed submission was the only rational choice. But here's the truth. The Dominion's power is based on a lie. They're not invincible. They're just bullies. And bullies only win as long as their victims believe they can't fight back. The message concluded with a simple statement. We are humanity. We are dying. And we are showing you how to fight. Take our gift. Use it. And remember, they can't enslave a galaxy that refuses to kneel. Part 6. The Ripple Effect. The effect was not immediate. It couldn't be. The Dominion's control systems were too sophisticated, too deeply embedded, for a single transmission to spark revolution. But the effect was real. On a world called Vareth 7, a species called the Korith, enslaved for 3,000 years, began whispering about the humans, about their resistance, about their message. On a world called Null Prime, the administrative hub of an entire sector, a junior clerk made a small error in a supply manifest. A small error that resulted in a weapons shipment being delayed by 3 months. When questioned, the clerk said nothing, but his eyes said everything. On a world at the very edge of Dominion space, a species called the Yith, who had never been conquered, only intimidated into alliance, quietly began reviewing their defensive capabilities. And they began talking to the Korith, and the Korith began talking to others. The Dominion's control had always been based on a simple principle: resistance is futile. The message from Earth didn't just challenge that principle, it provided evidence that it was false. Evidence is a dangerous thing. Commander Kravik received orders from the Eternal Throne 63 days after the bombardment began. The orders were unprecedented. Withdraw, not retreat. The Dominion didn't retreat. This was a strategic reallocation of resources. The humans were to be contained, not conquered. The Sol system was to be quarantined. And the events of Earth were to be classified at the highest level, never to be spoken of again. As the Harbinger began its departure, its sensors detected something they hadn't expected. A single human vessel, barely 50 meters long, rising from the ruined surface of Earth. It was broadcasting on an open frequency. Leaving so soon?
Kravik recognized the voice. Admiral Chen.
We wanted to give you a parting gift, something to remember us by, something to take back to your masters. The human vessel didn't attack. It didn't need to. As the Harbinger's sensors focused on the tiny craft, they detected something attached to its hull, a device, small, innocuous. That device contains a complete record of everything that happened here, Chen continued. Every battle, every atrocity, every moment of your failure. It's designed to broadcast continuously for the next 10,000 years. Anyone who comes near it will receive the message.
Kravik ordered the device destroyed. His weapons officers reported that they couldn't target it. The human craft was too small, too agile, and something about the device's construction was interfering with their targeting systems. "We call it the monument," Chen said. "We're going to plant 1,000 of them throughout your empire, in every system you control, on every world you've conquered. And every single one of them will carry the same message. The Dominion can be defeated. All you have to do is refuse to submit." The transmission ended. The human vessel vanished. Its engine signature simply disappeared from Dominion sensors. Kravik stared at the empty space where it had been, and for the first time in his 300-year career, he felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. Part 7, The New Rules. 50 years passed. The Dominion did not return to Earth. The quarantine held, not because the humans couldn't break it, but because they chose not to. They were rebuilding, recovering, and planning. But more importantly, they were teaching. The Monument program expanded beyond even Admiral Chen's original vision. Human-built devices appeared throughout Dominion space, carrying not just the message of Earth's resistance, but practical information. How to build weapons that could penetrate Dominion armor. How to organize cells that couldn't be infiltrated. How to fight a guerrilla war against an interstellar empire. The Dominion's response was predictable. They intensified security. They cracked down on dissent. They made examples of anyone caught accessing human transmissions. But they couldn't stop the spread of ideas. They couldn't unring the bell. And they couldn't change the fundamental reality that humanity had demonstrated. Resistance was possible. The first revolt occurred 12 years after the bombardment of Earth. The Korath rose up on Vareth 7, using tactics directly copied from human training transmissions. They didn't win, not initially, but they cost the Dominion more troops in a single week than they had lost in the previous century. The second revolt occurred 3 years later, then another, and another. The Dominion, which had never faced coordinated resistance, suddenly found itself fighting on dozens of fronts simultaneously. And they were losing. Not battles, they still won most of those. But they were losing something more important. They were losing the psychological foundation of their power, the belief that they couldn't be challenged. Admiral Chen died on the 47th anniversary of the bombardment. She was 93 years old, her body ravaged by the radiation exposure she had sustained during the early days of the resistance. But her mind remained sharp until the very end. Her final transmission was broadcast not just to Earth, but to the entire network of monument devices throughout the galaxy. It was, fittingly, a lesson. War is not about killing, she said. It's about will. The side that breaks first loses. The side that refuses to break, that finds meaning in the fight itself, cannot be defeated. They can only be destroyed. She coughed, and blood flecked her lips. The Dominion tried to destroy us. They failed. And in failing, they taught the galaxy something it had forgotten. Empires are not invincible. They're just stories that enough people believe. Change the story, and you change reality. Another cough. We changed the story. We made ourselves the enemy that couldn't be beaten. Not because we were strong, but because we refused to accept that strength was the only thing that mattered. We introduced the galaxy to a new kind of warfare. Not a war of ships and soldiers, a war of ideas, a war of will. She smiled, that same cold, calculating smile she had worn all those years ago in the UN Assembly. The Dominion will fall. Not today, maybe not in my lifetime, but it will fall. Because we proved something that can never be unproven. Resistance is never futile. Submission is never inevitable. And there is always, always another option. Her eyes closed. Humanity's answer to the Dominion's threat wasn't a weapon, it was a philosophy, and philosophies can't be killed. She died 3 hours later, surrounded by her staff, in a bunker deep beneath the rebuilt city of Geneva. Part 8. The Inheritance. 75 years after the bombardment. 120 years since the first message. The galaxy had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the beings who had issued that initial ultimatum. The Dominion still existed, but it was no longer eternal. It no longer controlled 12,000 species. It controlled perhaps 8,000, and that number was shrinking. The Korath had established an independent republic. So had the Yith. So had 17 other species who had looked at humanity's example and decided that death was preferable to slavery. And humanity? Humanity had become something new. The first human vessels to leave the Sol system did so 63 years after the bombardment. They weren't warships. Humanity still couldn't match Dominion firepower. They were something else. Teachers, advisors, carriers of a new philosophy of warfare. Wherever they went, resistance followed. The Dominion called them the Plague. Subject species called them the Liberators. Humanity called them the Prometheus Corps, named for the mythological figure who had stolen fire from the gods and given it to mortals. Their mission was simple: spread the knowledge that had allowed humanity to survive. Teach the tactics of asymmetric warfare. Demonstrate that an empire could be fought not through strength, but through will. And make the Dominion bleed. Commander Kravik was dead by the time the true scope of humanity's impact became clear. He had died of soul sickness, the same condition that had devastated his crew during the siege of the Harbinger. His final report, submitted 3 days before his death, was later recovered from Dominion archives. "We made an error in our initial assessment," he had written. "We classified humanity as a pre-emergence sentient species. This was technically accurate, but fundamentally misleading. Humanity did not need to emerge. They were already emerged, perhaps more emerged than any species in our records. We thought we understood war. We thought war was about power, the application of force to achieve political objectives. Humanity taught us that we were wrong. War is not about power. It is about meaning. The side that has more meaning will always defeat the side that has more power. Because power can be destroyed, but meaning cannot." We should have recognized this from the beginning. Their history should have warned us. This is a species that has been fighting and winning asymmetric conflicts for their entire existence. They invented guerrilla warfare. They invented psychological operations. They invented the concept of the moral victory, the idea that losing can be winning if you lose in the right way. We were not prepared for them. I do not believe any species could have been. My recommendation to the Eternal Throne is as follows: do not attempt to reconquer Earth. Do not attempt to contain the human philosophy. These efforts will fail. Instead, we must adapt. We must learn to fight the way humans fight. We must find meaning to match their meaning.
If we cannot do this, the Dominion will fall, not to human weapons, to human ideas. And ideas, as they have taught us, are immortal.
The message was never delivered. Kravik died before he could submit it, and his successors judged it too defeatist to forward to the throne.
But he was right. The Dominion fell 147 years after the bombardment of Earth. It didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. Empires rarely do. It simply faded, crumbled, bled out through 1,000 small wounds that never stopped being inflicted.
The final eternal throne was not overthrown. The last Dominion Empress simply woke one morning to find that her empire had ceased to exist. The species that had served her had stopped serving. The fleets that had enforced her will had stopped enforcing. The bureaucracy that had maintained her power had stopped maintaining. They had all, in their own ways, absorbed the lesson that humanity had taught the galaxy.
Submission is a choice, and choices can be changed.
Epilogue: The Monument. 300 years after the bombardment, a delegation from the Galactic Council, the loose federation of former Dominion subjects that had emerged from the Empire's ashes, traveled to Earth. They came to honor humanity, to thank the species that had shown them how to fight, to pay respects at the grave of Admiral Chen and the billions who had died to prove that resistance was possible. What they found surprised them. Earth had been rebuilt. Not as a military power, humanity still maintained relatively modest defensive forces compared to other galactic species, but as something else. A library, a school, a repository of the philosophy that had changed everything. The delegation was met by a human historian named Marcus Webb VII, a descendant 7 generations removed of the aide who had stood beside Admiral Chen on the day the first message arrived.
"You've come to see the monument," Webb said. It wasn't a question.
"We have." Webb led them to a chamber deep beneath Geneva, the same bunker where Chen had died. In the center of the chamber stood a holographic display, constantly shifting, constantly updating. It showed the galaxy, every system, every world, and on each world a small marker indicating something.
"What are we looking at?" the delegation's leader asked.
"Every act of resistance in the galaxy," Webb said. "Every uprising, every liberation, every moment when someone looked at overwhelming power and chose to fight anyway. We've been tracking them since the beginning. There are currently 847,000 active markers." The delegation stared at the display in silence. "This is the monument," Webb continued. "Not the physical devices we scattered throughout the galaxy. This, the ongoing proof that what we did here mattered, that the lesson we taught is still being learned." He smiled, and in that smile, the delegation saw something of the woman who had stood before the United Nations all those centuries ago and declared that humanity would become something worth fearing. The Dominion thought they could threaten us into submission. They thought we would calculate the odds, recognize our weakness, and surrender. They didn't understand that humans don't calculate odds the way other species do. We don't ask, "Can we win?" We ask, "Is this worth fighting for?" And the answer to that question is never about probability. It's about meaning. He gestured at the display. Every one of those markers represents someone who asked that question and answered yes. Someone who decided that their freedom, their dignity, their meaning was worth dying for. The Dominion couldn't defeat us because they couldn't kill our meaning. And now, across the entire galaxy, that meaning has spread. It's become bigger than us, bigger than any empire. It's become the new rule of war. The delegation's leader bowed, a gesture of deep respect among his species. What is that rule?
Webb's smile widened.
The rule is simple. You can't enslave a species that refuses to kneel. You can only destroy them. And destruction proves their point. It demonstrates that they had something worth fighting for, something the tyrant couldn't tolerate. He looked up at the galaxy rotating slowly above them. The Dominion issued a threat. Humanity's answer rewrote the rules of war. And now, those rules belong to everyone. That's our legacy. That's what we gave the galaxy. Not weapons, not technology. Just a simple truth that every tyrant fears. The will to resist is stronger than the power to oppress. He paused. As long as that truth exists, empires will fall. As long as someone, somewhere, looks at overwhelming force and chooses to fight anyway, the universe will remain free. The delegation remained in the chamber for a long time after Webb left, watching the markers blink and shift, each one a testament to the strange species that had looked at an empire and seen not an enemy to be fought, but a lesson to be taught. The Dominion had tried to enslave humanity. Humanity had enslaved the Dominion to a new idea. And ideas, as they had proven, are truly immortal. Final note, recorded in the archives of the Galactic Council. Of all the species that contributed to the fall of the Eternal Dominion, humanity remains the most studied and the least understood. Their military contributions were minimal in conventional terms. They never fielded a fleet, never conquered a world, never won a major engagement through force of arms. Their contribution was psychological, philosophical. They demonstrated that war is not a contest of strength, but a contest of will. They proved that an empire's power is only as real as its subjects' belief in that power. And they showed, through their own suffering and sacrifice, that some things are worth more than survival. The Dominion could have destroyed humanity entirely. They had the capability. But they couldn't destroy what humanity represented. They couldn't kill the idea that resistance was possible. That idea spread. It infected every corner of the galaxy. It became, in the end, more powerful than any fleet or weapon. When historians ask how the Eternal Dominion fell, the answer is simple. It encountered a species that didn't know it was supposed to surrender. A species that saw extinction not as defeat, but as martyrdom. A species that understood, in a way the Dominion never could, that meaning is more important than survival. The Dominion issued a threat. Humanity's answer rewrote the rules of war. And the galaxy will never be the same. Final entry in the historical archives of the Galactic Council, submitted 500 years after first contact by an anonymous human historian. The end.